How many discounts does USAA Auto Insurance offer? Too many to say here. Multi-vehicle discount, safe driver discount, new vehicle discount, storage discount, legacy.
How many discounts will you stack up? Visit USAA.com/auto discounts. Restrictions apply.
Have you heard about Hyphenly from Immigrantly Media? It's a curated roundup of books, articles, music, podcasts, and other interesting things we think you'll love, delivered straight to your inbox. Subscribe to Hyphenly. The link to the newsletter is in the show notes. And now to today's episode. Hey everyone, it's Kavitha Davidson, and welcome to another episode of Sportly. Each week, we discuss lesser-known sports history, iconic events, notable athletes, and impactful moments on and off the field. Moments that all too often fall to the sidelines of history. But starting today, we're kicking off something a little different, a series of interview episodes. We'll be talking with sports industry experts who can take us behind the scenes, giving us fresh perspectives on the stories, trends, and financial forces shaping the games that we love. And our first guest is the perfect person to launch this series, Jane McManus. Jane has worn just about every hat in the sports media world. She's been a beat writer covering the New York Jets for my local paper, the New York Daily News. She's been a columnist and radio host at ESPN. She was editor of the year's best sports writing last year, 2024. And she is currently teaching the next generation of journalists at Columbia University. And now she's added another to the list with her new book. She is an author, and her book is The Fast Track: Inside the Surging Business of Women's Sports. She spent her career chronicling sports at every level, from the press box to the classroom, and she brings a rare combination of experience and insight to conversations about where sports have been and where they're going. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jane, where we talk about the business of women's sports, the sports media landscape, and the ageless wonder that is Venus Williams. Jane, it's always good to see you. How are you?
I am great. I've just had some very lengthy and difficult travel that I am back from. So I am so excited to be here and talk to you, Kavitha.
Always good. Are you back from Seattle?
Yeah, I got back yesterday.
Tell our listeners what exciting things you were in Seattle for.
I was there to see the first women's national team for the U.S. Keep in mind, there was no Women's World Cup until 1991. Mm-hmm. Anyway, these women are now, they've had full lives. They've seen how far soccer has come, and the Seattle Reign honored them at halftime during their game against Chicago. And it was really moving. Like, these women are incredible.
Tonight, the Seattle Reign is celebrating 40 years since the first U.S. women's national team took the field in 1985. The moment was even more
phenomenal. Would you say most of these women are in their 50s and 60s at this point?
Yeah, it's fair to say. And Michelle Akers is one of them, right? Like, representative of the U.S., one of the best athletes of all time, really. She's one of them, but she has all these fantastic teammates, and some of them, never really played again at that level, So, I mean, it was such a DIY kind of thing. I think there was ambiguity about whether or not, the U.S. should be fielding an international women's team. Like, for what?
From hand-me-down uniforms to Nike not making enough uniforms for the rest of us to buy.
Exactly. The world has changed quite a bit, and it's just great. So anyway, I cheered alongside everybody else watching these women get these honors.
That's awesome. Why is Seattle such a great women's sports town? It just is.
There's an interesting history there, but certainly going back, was kind of interesting hearing some of the women on this team, the 85ers, talk about how they grew up and there were adult women's leagues on the West Coast and in Washington State. Soccer has been powerful there for a long time. It is definitely different than the rest of the country. I mean, I remember growing up, and I'm, 10 years younger than a lot of those women, but I remember growing up and not having access to sports in the same way that they had access to.
Right. And obviously the Seattle Storm has a giant following, and it's just they had one of the first women's sports bars. And Seattle's just a great town in general, but it's a fantastic town if you're into women in sports. This is a great lead-in to your book, which I will always be your hype man. So your book, The Fast Track, about the business of women's sports and the history there, you've been on this kind of whirlwind tour in the last 6 months since your book was published, promoting it and talking about it. What has it been like to have the reception that you've had for this book?
It's been really gratifying. Yeah, I've spoken to a lot of schools. I've been to the Final Four. I, just was in Seattle. I've been to a couple Liberty games. What I love is talking to groups of college students, and I teach, and I toured a lot of colleges, particularly in the Boston area, and the attitude about women's sports and who gets to play and who gets to be celebrated for playing is completely different in that demographic.
Are we at a point where it's just a default?
Well, I think for a cohort, for 25 and under, those young people, their heroes weren't just Tom Brady. It was Tom Brady and all of these different women who played different sports, Candace Parker, or now Caitlin Clark. They are all intimately familiar. Serena Williams and these, great athletes. There's not that divide where it's 1 and 1A anymore. You can pick and choose your heroes now from a lot of different places. And I think that's made a real difference in the way people think about what the future is for women's sports. That is the demographic that people want. If you're an advertiser, that's what you want. If you're a product and you want to sell to people, that's who you want.
The 18 to 24, listen,
Yeah. So the idea is that, if you want to reach young people, you can go through women's sports now. And that simple fact has put it in a completely different place in terms of the profitability.
Yeah. And, you're obviously a very accomplished academic in addition to all of the journalism that you've done. And I've been very lucky to speak to a bunch of your classes. And every year that I do one of your classes, it feels like there are more and more girls. And I think the last time I did one of your classes at NYU, the female students were more than 50% of your class.
Yeah, for sure. Part of that is the demographic of higher ed right now. We have a lot of women who are coming into the system. And in some ways, we have to make sure that, the true spirit of Title IX is, of course, education for everyone. So making sure that other demographics aren't getting left behind. But absolutely, I think, when I started off and I decided I wanted to be a sports writer, I was like, can I do that? There was this question of, is that okay? But that is not a question that anybody asks now. And I think, more and more young women are thinking, well, I'd like to make a living in sports too. And the idea, when I started off, and even when you were getting started, probably, Kavitha, the idea of making a living in women's sports was a real long shot.
Mm-hmm. I majored in urban planning.
Yeah.
I didn't think I was going to be able to do this and make money.
How do you feel about that transition there? Feel good about that?
I've written a lot about stadium building.
Well, exactly. I do think that, people are, in particularly young women, are like, well, why not me? Why can't I cover it? I played, when I came out and was a sports writer starting in 1997, I had played also, but that was not considered real sports, right? You played women's sports by virtue of being a woman, which is totally different than actually pro sports. And I think now people are like, no, it's, you played sports. The sports experience is the same. You get the same benefit from it. We're instilling the same cultural values. We're learning the same things about collaboration and taking criticism and
teamwork and, rising from failure and all of that.
100%. And so all of those great things that we think people get from sports, everybody gets from sports. And I think now there's realization for that.
And game recognized game. Male athletes absolutely recognize female athletes now in a way that they hadn't before.
That has been such a game changer. It's about conferring status, conferring value. In some ways, it's the least male athletes can do when they appreciate a woman who plays sports. And also, it's a big deal. So it can be both of those things at once.
Well, already in our conversation, we've talked about how the myth is that no one cares about women's sports. And obviously that hasn't really persisted into this younger generation. But why had that myth persisted for as many decades, if not centuries, as it did?
Well, so let's say no one cares about women's sports. Let's take that little phrase. It's an expression of apathy, but it's not apathy. It's hostility. And so there's always been hostility to women in the space. And part of the reason, and I feel like, Kavitha, this so well also, but for your listeners, we are only allowed to do in sports what we are allowed to do in society. And so your abilities to succeed to a lesser extent now, but certainly, if you go back 50 years and you think about Jackie Robinson and, you think about all of these different milestones in sports and people breaking the quote unquote the fill in the blank barrier in sports, it's because those barriers were there in society. And so, whether it's your color, your religion, your immigration status, your gender, how you want to live in the world, it was all affected. You carried that into athletics with you. And there were expressions of hostility. I mean, toward women in particular, but not exclusively toward women, and it was this idea that, well, if you're great, you'll be accepted no matter what. And I think that's not exactly true. There are people who have been great athletes who've been drummed out of different sports based on their political beliefs, for example, or for other reasons. And certainly great athletes were kept out of pro leagues during times of segregation. And of course, just as I saw with the 1985 team, great athletes in the context of women's sports were not always recognized and elevated. And so I think that is part of this idea that no one cares about women's sport is really, it's more of a demand than it is a statement of fact. And it's a way of communicating to other people that they shouldn't care about women's sports. When Together takes that phrase and turns it around and puts on a t-shirt, everyone cares about women's sports. Wearing that and expressing that is a refutation of that hostility. But I do think it warrants examination, and it's fine that that's what's happening now. But that hostility is still there.
A very recent example of this hostility, and also just where we are as an economy and a society, is the dildo scandal of these dudes that have been, and in one case, actually a woman, throwing dildos onto the court during WNBA games.
Oh, look out. Something just came onto the floor. Got an object that just flew in as the free throw.
I'm curious what your initial reaction to that was, and then what your reaction to it was when it came out that this was part of a cryptocurrency scheme.
So I love a good prank. Let's just start off with that.
I feel like the players themselves thought this was hilarious, so it was okay for me to think this was hilarious.
So from a prank point of view, I do think that. But I do think, if you look at the larger what's happening in culture writ large, I think there's a backlash now to the WNBA, and it's coming from the crypto quarter. To me, that wasn't just another expression of hostility, frankly. It wasn't being in on a joke or being part of a joke. It was really done to denigrate the game. I think we see whenever people are able to pull away from those constraints that are based on identity, that there are people who want to reinforce those constraints pretty quickly. And I look at the body positivity movement and then the backlash to the body positivity movement that we're now seeing in the era of Ozempic and in some other ways. And if society can't enforce those standards, certain people feel threatened. And there are lots of different ways that gets expressed. And I think that, what we saw with the WNBA, and that was simply a way of being like, don't get too comfortable.
Shaq here, spinning fast-acting pain relief with Icy Hot. Ice works fast, heat makes it last. Icy Hot, you're so back.
Brace the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started today at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
You have Caitlin Clark on the cover of your book, obviously, for good reason. Why is this the moment? Why have these past years been the years that women's sports finally, culturally, financially, in all of the ways have broken through?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do actually with the idea of equity. When the WNBA started, it was very much the audience that it was going for. Who was it that they saw as their fan? And they saw male sports fans, converting male sports fans into fans of women's sports. And that certainly, first of all, there are huge numbers of men who are watching and following women's sports. And it has traditionally been more than the number of women who are watching, following women's sports. So that's important. There are actually men who enjoy women's sports. But I think there was this idea that, well, if we really want to succeed, we have to get the audience for men's sports to like women's sports. And so, we would have to make those athletes then pleasing in the way that, successful women's sports have been. And so if you look at tennis, feminized sports, individual athletes, that kind of thing. So when the WNBA comes out, you have Rebecca Lobo and Lisa Leslie and Cheryl Swoops, and they're made up and they're done, nice photo shoots. And, these athletes are not threatening to you. They're not lesbians. Don't worry. You can bring your kids to these games. It's going to be fun. It really kind of was this way of kind of trying to curate and keep out certain natural audiences for women's sports. And so I think, there was this push and pull a little bit with who are we trying to get into these games, shying away from any kind of social issue, any kind of political statement, any kind of affiliation with women's liberation, any of that. And then you get to women's soccer in the late 2010s, where, there is talk about equal pay, equity. You have the excellence, right, in play. You have excellence. And then, you have in France during the World Cup in 2019, chants of equal pay, like all across the fields, the fans doing these chants of equal pay. Women's sports are building through this whole period of time. And then the pandemic hits, and then you have the NCAA basketball tournament where the men have a huge ballroom and the women have a tiny triangle of weights.
I got something to show y'all. So for the NCAA March Madness, the biggest tournament in college basketball for women, this is our weight room. Let me show y'all the men's weight room.
Now, I don't have to tell you this, but women lift weights. Like athletes, men and women, they're in the weight room all the time. Like those muscles, they don't come on their own.
Serena doesn't serve 130 miles an hour for nothing,
That's right. Exactly. And, Charlie Collier was one of the athletes for Texas at that time and she was like, she had very impressive biceps. She was like stacked. And it was just, and the thing is like, if those women need to lift weights also, like they are trying to maintain their peak physicality as well. And so the fact that they didn't have access to the basic equipment to do that, when you had literally both tournaments in a bubble because of the pandemic, and then Sedona Prince gets up there and she points out the inequity and it goes viral. And then you have the NCAA has to do an examination of its own practices. They're found to be woefully inequitable.
The visual of the difference in the facilities and the resources afforded to men and women trickle down all the way to something as seemingly small as not even being able to call the women's tournament March Madness.
Correct. Have a law firm then that comes in and does a full assessment and says to the NCAA, you are leaving millions of dollars on the table every year by not platforming this game, by not promoting this game in the way that you easily do with the men.
Guess what, guys? We got a weight room, yeah! We got a ton more dumbbells. Look at that. Look at all these racks for squats and whatever we want to do. We got a bunch of bands. Look at this, guys. And we got some equipment.
So I think it also caused broadcasters to start assessing, well, are we also complicit in this inequity? And then you have the NCAA does this reexamination. ESPN, I think, also participates in that a bit. And then the next year, well, who comes along? But it's Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark as juniors. And so they are platformed differently. It is March Madness. Like the games are findable. They're putting them on ESPN. And all of a sudden the numbers are up. The platform had to be there. And then, of course, they head into the WNBA. And now you have record attendance, The thing is, these things don't happen in a vacuum. Caitlin Clark just doesn't arrive and change a system. The system was in process of changing because of the spotlight that had been shown on it in all of these smaller ways. And so when she arrives, well, if nobody knows who she is when she enters the WNBA, people still aren't going to know who she is. But the fact of the matter is, all of those little things had changed to create the opportunity that Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese can really take advantage of. They are known quantities now. Audiences recognize them as great. And that is not just because one person arrives on the scene, but it is because the ability to see them and to experience what they're doing and to witness the greatness unfold. I think that's a big part of it.
Well, and you've written in your book something that, those of us who have covered women's sports for a long time have kind of echoed throughout the years, which is, the smart play is to invest now. And, you had commissioned, when you were at Seton Hall, you had commissioned a YouGov poll that showed that 57% of avid sports fans wanted to see more competitions with men and women. But when you took that data point to Billie Jean King, she basically was skeptical. She said, nobody will budge on this. People get used to whatever it is they're losing. Essentially, it feels comfortable to be leaving this money on the table. So what finally flipped that switch in the eyes of the advertisers, the broadcast partners, the executives in the room that are mostly beholden to their shareholders and their bottom lines?
First of all, Billie Jean King gets credit for starting the World Team Tennis. Like, she actually tried to pioneer a kind of a co-ed league, which is, I personally think that's a great place to think about growth in the future as well. I mean, we tend to have a binary because of Title IX and because the opportunities that Title IX afforded would not have been there otherwise. So there's that. And so I think that does kind of change the way people think about it. But I think what has happened is social media proved audience. I think is also when you have, Megan Rapinoe or Serena Williams or any other number of women in sports, even Ilona Maher, let's look at her. Now these athletes showed that there was an audience. And the idea of, influencer, women's sports and the women who play women's sports, they're the biggest influencers of all in a lot of ways. And I think that hostility, reluctance, et cetera, for people who are very invested in the success of men's sports kind of kept them from being able to see the return on investment that comes around with women's sports. But now you're seeing like these valuations for teams like the Valkyries at 500 million. You used to be able to buy a WNBA team for like 15 mil, something like that, like crazy low. But now there is this provable investment on the other side if you're doing it. And I also think there's, if you're using Livy Dunn or, Paige Beckers, Asia Wilson, they really can help you penetrate a market because of their reach. And so I think that's been a big difference. It's always been that people who care about women's sports had to convince men with money to invest in it. Now I think what you're seeing is Michelle Kang, Clara Lusai. I even think about Nadia Rawlinson at the Sky in the WNBA. And there are all of these women who have real chops. Like, they're coming from industries where they are able to make money. They're in a different echelon because of that. So they can speak in the language of money to people that they want to help get to convince to invest. And they can make that case. Sports Innovation Lab, putting together the data that shows the interest around women's sports. Like, all of those numbers, you can put them in a PowerPoint, you can get your deck, and you show somebody who wants to invest. It changes the game, right? That's a language that is spoken in these investment circles. The language that isn't as effective is it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to change the strategy to convince people of the value of women's sports from a moral to an economic argument has made a huge difference. And I'm not saying that there isn't a moral argument for it. It's not as effective.
Well, and you talked about the power of social media in making that argument. Do you think that power is most effective when it's with the individual athletes, when it's wielded by leagues and networks? The way that social media continually rapidly evolves is a little bit scary, but also definitely plays a major role in the growth of this space.
Social media platforms can sometimes have a voice that's really interesting and fun and effective. Pop-Tarts.
Steakums. I can't remember the last time I had a Steakum, but I know their tweets.
There are companies and there are leagues that are doing that well, but I think it really is that people don't connect in the way that they connect with athletes. I personally love following Ilona Maher. I love her adventures through the world, whether it's Dancing with the Stars, Sports Illustrated. Like, she's just an interesting person with an interesting life, and her sisters. And I find a connection with her. You have to get somebody's emotions, right, in order to get them to be a fan, right? Their emotions have to be involved. And so men's leagues have had generations now where you have those associations through family ties, through shared experience, watching games with people in your family or friends or extended geographic group. But women have to have a shorthand for that. And the fans of women's sports have to have a shorthand for that, because in most cases, you don't have that kind of generational affiliation yet. But one of the ways to do it is to find a Sue Bird or, a Candace Parker or somebody who you really identify with and connect to that person. And then, that's who you end up.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Paris. I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and Auto Camp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
You're tuned into Auto Intelligence, live from Auto Trader, where data, tools, and your preferences sync to make your car shopping smooth.
They're searching inventory.
Oh, yeah.
They find what you need.
They're gonna find it.
You can make a budget for your wallet to help you succeed. Pricing's precise and true.
So true.
It's smarter car shopping.
Ooh.
Just for you.
Oh, it's just for you. Ooh. Find your next ride at autotrader.com. Powered by Auto Intelligence.
I feel like we've known for years that women, athletes, celebrities, just influencers, whoever, women are just better at social media on the whole. They tend to be able to build followings more easily. But women's sports fans are also younger and more brand loyal. Like, do you have a theory for, first of all, why that is specific to the women's sports fan demographic, and like how that can be further captured for this space?
I actually do have a theory about that. So it's the same reason that fans of women's sports are going to chant equal pay on the field. I don't think you can separate the struggle that women have had to gain traction in the area of sports from the fan base. Like, it's not like those are two separate things. Like, if you're a fan of equity, that's a gateway drug. You know what I mean? Like, you want to see them succeed because you know how hard that struggle has been. Like, no one who is a fan of Gotham is going to be surprised that it's been harder for women to succeed as athletes or to make a living or anything like that. That's baked into the equation. So there's no reason to try to pretend that there's no connection. And so you're kind of, in some ways, then that means that you're dealing with a sophisticated fan base that is open to support. And they feel like what they're doing is supporting women in this realm, and they are appreciative when they see other people and entities and corporations and products supporting women in this realm. It's all part of the same dynamic. And so I think that's why if you see a brand, like Ally Bank, making a big push to support women, you might be like, you know what? That is aligned with my values. That brand is aligned with my values. And that's a deeper connection, I think, than just like, you know, I like Pop-Tarts, which I do. I like Pop-Tarts. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I think that is you're like, oh, if I could choose between these two things and one of them is aligned with my values, then you're going to go with the one that's more aligned with your values. And I just think that fans of women's sports, and this has been shown in some of the data that's come out of like Sports Innovation Labs and Wasserman and some other places, that fans of women's sports are more attuned to that, and they are making buying decisions based on that. So I think that's definitely a game changer.
Well, and marketers have found in recent years that every successive generation, younger and younger consumers do vote with their dollars, essentially. They choose the brands that they are loyal to and the products that they buy based on whether or not they align with their values. So as we start to like capture younger fans, that's going to be part of that kind of natural progression there.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is it's a really crowded marketplace in men's sports. If you advertise in the Super Bowl, you're getting bang for your buck. But if you advertise on like average baseball game or, NBA game, you're competing against thousands of other brands that are trying to use that same space as a platform. Women's sports is more of the boutique, where there's not as much competition among the brands that are in that space right now. And so your bang for your buck is going to be higher if you are one of a smaller number of brands in that space reaching a very loyal audience.
And you and I had a conversation recently about how while we have made incredible strides in advertising both women athletes and using women athletes to advertise other products, we still seem to kind of be stuck in this space right now where like a lot of these advertisers don't really know what to do with them. Either, an ad is going to be like, oh, she's really tall or something just a little bit reductive, right? So how do we then break through to like, oh, these are women with interesting histories and stories and personalities and not just, they're tall and they have ponytails?
Well, I would think that comes down to the people that you're hiring to put together these campaigns. You and I have had plenty of offline conversations also about when women's sports gets big, who do they pull in to do anything around women's sports? Well, they're pulling for the people who've been doing the other sports campaigns, the men's sports campaigns, rather than trying to find people who are either fans of women's sports and including them, have a knowledge base of it. The institutional knowledge around women's sports is there, but many of those voices aren't included. If you're a company that wants to engage in it, the more authentically you're doing that, the better your campaign's going to be. But if you're pulling in people who are like, can you believe how good these women are? That's the lowest level of observation that you could possibly make, and you need people who are making higher level observations and connections, because the fans now of these leagues and these teams and these athletes are much more sophisticated and are going to have more institutional knowledge. And so you need to be able to meet that. I remember when I started covering the Jets many, many moons ago, I grew up playing basketball. I did not grow up being an NFL fan. And the person who, assigned me this said, look, you've got to know more than the Jets fans know. You've got to understand this team the way a Jets fan does. I wouldn't start covering the Jets and be like, you know what? Those uniforms are so green. You know what I'm saying? Like, I had to work to get a better understanding of the Jets so that I could hit the ground and just be credible. And I think that same amount of work has to go into when you're thinking about women's sports and how you want to approach it. That level of authenticity, getting in people who actually care about it, as opposed to, oh, my boss cares about it, so I'm going to pretend I'm on board with it. That's what I'd say about that. And the same thing with media. I'm embarrassed by how slow traditional media has been to come to the table on covering women's sports in a real way. A lot of those jobs go for less money than the jobs covering men's sports. And so, I mean, it's just, to me, that, obviously the time had come actually a long time ago, and this is very late to the table, but I'm glad that people are finally understanding the value here to the fans.
The biggest story probably in women's sports right now is the WNBPA opting out of their collective bargaining agreement and the ongoing negotiations there.
We're all on the same page for this off season, and we're going to do what it takes to make sure that not only we reap the benefits of this new CBA coming into play, but the next generation of women don't have to fight to be a part of the 144. There is money out there to come.
Just for a little bit of background for listeners, obviously WNBA valuations have skyrocketed in recent years. The Liberty were valued at $400 million. I think the Fever at $370. And along that has come calls from the athletes and their fans for higher salaries, more resources, better investment, all of that. What is your read on where CBA negotiations are right now? Because they're getting a little contentious, I think, in a way that men's CBA negotiations always are. At the WNBA All-Star Game, the players had "Pay Us What You Owe Us," a little nod to Rihanna t-shirts there, which, can I also just say, I am always in awe of how quickly WNBA players can just bang out t-shirts.
Well, it's a small league, up until last year, it was 144 players, so
12 teams of 12 players. Yeah.
You can be nimble when you're that small. If you're the NFL, that's a much larger group to wrangle. Salaries are a function of revenue, right? So you have to be bringing in a certain amount of revenue. That's the way it works in men's pro leagues. But the percentage of revenue that the players have gotten at the WNBA is really small, and it could be improved. And the other thing is, I look back to the way that they dealt with charter flights. So last year, Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese come into the league. There's way more attention to it. Anybody could have predicted that, especially since the year before Brittany Griner had been harassed at a Dallas airport. These players taking commercial flights, they're open to harassment. They're open to delays. It just took me 17 hours to take a 5-hour flight. So that's fine for me, human being. Not so great if you're getting up to play a game the next day, right? Like, that would be a challenge. So it's like, how are you professionalizing the environment around them? It wasn't until a month into the season last year that the WNBA approved the charter flights. And that was challenging because it hadn't yet renegotiated a broadcast deal that brought in $2 billion and kind of put it under the WNBA part of the ledger sheet, which is a bit iffy anyway when you look at the way the NBA and the WNBA are accrediting money to each, because they share so much when it comes to marketing deals and licensing, stuff like that.
This is a constant theme in breaking down the actual like value and revenues from in women's sports, whether it's the World Cup or March Madness. When you bundle the broadcast deals or the marketing deals, it's really hard to like actually isolate what the value there is.
And I think too often when people are making those decisions, they're just assuming that most of it's coming
from the men.
Right. As opposed to, it's like when U.S. Soccer bundled MLS and U.S. Women's National Team broadcast rights. I mean, the U.S. Women's National Team was the premier event there, not the men's property. The men's property was the ride along. But it was impossible then for the women to say, look at our value, because you could never disentangle the two. So I think that's kind of what's happening here with the WNBA too. But it's also about what are you banking on? And I think the way that the WNBA has had a scarcity mindset for so long. I think it's really hard for them to think about abundance coming. And really, when you look at it, and when you look at the ratings and the attendance and the valuations, it's all up, 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 up. But I think there's still this, whoa, we can't extend too far because it could all disappear in a second. And I think so there was kind of a leap of faith in making those charter flights available to everybody for every game a month in last year. It was well backed up by then the broadcast deal that they signed. It made it very much worth it. And I think the same thing needs to happen now. And I think what the PA is doing is saying, look, we're providing the value. Please let us open up and think about this as the business that it is and as the surging business that it is. Think about how much does it cost to make that widget? Can we sell it for 12 cents more? It's like very short-term, long ago way of looking at their market and at their valuation and at their potential. I think that the players are like, okay, your way of doing that, it may have served us during the lean years wandering the desert, but we're now in a different place and it's time to think about this business in a different way. I think that's the tension that's happening right now.
Totally. And that's backed up by some of the most recent reporting about the conversations that are going on, right? Like, obviously, as you mentioned, the PA, the union, and the players are looking for a larger percentage of revenue to go to salaries, which is how their salaries increase. The NBA players get close to 50%. I think WNBA players after the last restructuring get 20 to 25, which is still not great, but it was 10 before. So, but the other thing that they said, which was so interesting because the players know the business better than anybody, right? And the players themselves said, we want a higher percentage of that revenue, but we also want it to be structured in a way that accounts for the immense growth that is going to happen in the next several years. That this is not a stagnant thing, the way that a lot of CBAs in longer established leagues and more revenue generating leagues do have, right?
But because the NFL, it can't make another dollar. It's making dollar it can make, right? But women's sports are not. They're not making every dollar they can make. And that's why there's such more room for them to improve in how much money they're bringing in and the marketing that goes on, et cetera. I think another really important thing to mention is Wasserman, which is an agency that represents a lot of women and men in sports. They put together, maybe it was 2 years ago now, a statistic that is 84% of the amount of money that a player in women's sports earns every year, 84% is from endorsements. And the rest is from their salary. Now that's flipped the other way for men because the salaries are so high. But because the salaries are so low in most women's sports still, women's tennis is the exception. But because the salaries are so low, those women are out there hustling for endorsement deals. That's why they know the business so well. That's why they know how much money is out there. That's why they know that there's so much interest in investing in the league and in women's sports more generally, is because they are out there beating the bushes. Their agents are out there beating the bushes for every dollar they can find so that they can make a living. I added up everything that Megan Rapinoe made on the field when she was playing, and it was $1 million over a 15-year period. And then I went and I looked, Department of Labor statistics at what the average income would have been for the average American worker during that time. And it was about $1 million, maybe a little bit less. So you could have been the best soccer player in the world during the 2000s and 2010s and made the same as an accountant, right? That's what we're talking about. The best players in the world should be making something that is more reflective of their interest that they're generating and the value that they're bringing. And at this point, the women in the WNBA really understand that. And I think that they are pulling in a much more fiscally conservative entity to their point of view.
I love when you said earlier that the league itself has had a scarcity mentality, because that leads me to something that you and I have also talked about offline, which is that those of us who love women's sports and see the value in women's sports also kind of have to contend with the tension of covering women's sports as journalists versus being the cheerleaders for these leagues, which is something that we see increasingly in sports media, just whether or not we're talking about women's sports, right? How do you think we handle that tension where any kind of criticism of the league or league practices, often rightfully, can be seen as criticism of women athletes' right to exist?
That is a bit of a tension. I come from like the old school journalism where, you're detached and impassive whenever you're covering anything. And I remember when I covered the first Liberty game at Madison Square Garden in 1997, and I'm sitting there and they dim the lights and they start calling the names of these incredible players, Rebecca Lobo, Kim Hampton, Teresa Weatherspoon, Sophia Witherspoon. Like, I got choked up, and I'm thinking to myself, I have to be detached. And I was choked up. Like, I'd seen, any number of Knicks games on that floor, and to see these women coming and playing. And I felt like that was something that I had to really get over at that time in order to be able to cover them in a detached way. But, it's like for many years, it was either I cover it or it doesn't get covered. So I ended up raising my hand to cover more women's sports just because I wanted to see them cover. I care about them. It's hard for me to pretend that I don't care about the success of women's sports. I do. And I think being upfront about that is fine. But that does not mean that if somebody makes a terrible financial decision, I think more coverage of the NWSL or the WNBA over the years, more serious coverage of them, would have made them better leagues. I think about the NWSL, the abuse scandals. Had somebody been able to crack that sooner, might some of those players been spared that suffering? So to me, a good, healthy, inquisitive press around women's sports and the issues in women's sports is a good thing. But unfortunately, there are a lot of really unsophisticated people in traditional media who've come in and covered women's sports and stepped in it. And I think that that's burned some players. And so the idea of a robust and inquisitive press is not something that's very much welcome within the PA circles necessarily. So there is a bit of tension there. But again, I think we're getting to a place now where there are some entities that are covering women's sports, more from the financial side than from the competitive side, frankly, that are doing a better job and, being more forthright about the coverage. And I think there's a place for really supportive coverage. It's not necessarily journalism in the traditional way.
And we need both. We need all of it, right? This leads us to like the overall conversation about just kind of the state of sports media, right? I mean, Trump's administration just defunded NPR. We've had a, degradation of local journalism just for decades now. It's been a slow burn, but it's been happening, obviously. The idea of the beat reporter comes along with that. You were a longtime beat reporter for the New York Daily News, an institution of my hometown paper. And then we have things like, ESPN, which you and I both worked at, and we're very grateful to have had that kind of a platform, just signing this partnership with the NFL where the NFL owns 10% of the network now. Where do you see the industry going? Where is the consumer going? How do we maintain what you and I believe is the bastions of journalism for an industry that deserves to be covered like the billion-dollar industry it is, while also understanding that it is entertainment and sports are fun?
Yeah, I mean, problem is that the traditional financial structure for journalism has absolutely evaporated. Single copy sales. Who do you see reading the paper on the subway now? Not that many people. So what's replaced that are sponsorships. So they're getting like USA Today or ESPN, or they're doing like paid partnerships with betting companies or other companies. But betting companies have really filled the void for a lot of them. And so that's why, when you turn on ESPN, you're often getting coverage, not about the games, but how to bet on the games, and I think that's a big difference. And so all of that really muddies the water because there is no church and state anymore for a lot of places, especially like if you have a deal with a league, there is more of a voice that they have in terms of shaping coverage. And that squeezes out some of the critical coverage. Now, maybe you don't lament that. But I do. I think that kind of coverage is important. It is an incentive to keep the games clean, to be forthright about how you're dealing with players medically. The idea that your practices could come to light is an incentive to keep things on the up and up. And when that goes away, when you don't have that light, that spotlight that can be shown on things, then the incentives are different. The incentives are for profit. The incentives are for cutting corners. And that to me, in something like sports, which I care about and which we think is based on character, and that part of the reason it's different is because we're all kind of personally invested, or we want our kids to have heroes. We want them to learn these values when they play, like all of these different things. You talk about, like, think about how many times you've heard a ball player say in an interview, I'm just out there playing a kid's game. It is this connection that we have with sports is different than the business section has with business. And so I just think for me, it does feel different. And I feel like I want to see that shining light journalism in sports still, as opposed to just journalism becoming the hype man and the bookie. To me, that's important. I think something's lost when it's all boiled down to numbers and dollar signs, because the emotional connection is what makes it different.
The emotional connection is what they're able to bank on.
Correct. And if you're going to make money off of my emotions, then it's a higher standard.
For sure. There's a very common saying in our industry that we hear all the time, which is just football is king. NFL coverage is going to dominate. The NFL prints money, and the coverage therein is just guaranteed eyeballs and everything. How do we balance that, knowing what the business and the financial realities are? How do we balance that with the need to do storytelling about women's sports or just anything else, basically?
I think that's certainly true in a television context, what you're saying about the NFL. Like, what is it? 17 of the top 20 shows every year in the ratings are NFL broadcasts of one variety or another. So I think there's that. But, talk about the polling. I've done polling through Marist when I was at Marist, and Seton Hall, of course, has done U.gov polls. If you say, do you consider yourself a sports fan? And you get all of those respondents, 100%. And you then poll sports fans. Are you a fan of the NFL? I think the number is like 70%. It's not 100%, right? So it's not that the NFL is the sports fan and then everybody else is getting the dregs. So, yes, the numbers of the people who are watching the NFL and engaging with it in that way, it is printing money. It is all of those things, but it's not every sports fan. So we wouldn't say, for example, oh, you like cereal? Well, there's Captain Crunch already, so we really don't have to care about these other cereals. Like, there's a lot of variety of the kinds. When you walk down the cereal aisle, you see lots of different kinds of cereal. And just because one cereal sells the most does not mean these other cereals go off the market. They all have their audiences. There's the big sports monolithic culture that we consider to be baseball, sometimes hockey, but that's actually not, like, there are people who love sports but don't want to participate in the monoculture. And so it's having the different options for different kinds of people who want to be sports fans in different ways. So I look at, we would never devalue a market for a very crunchy organic cereal that only certain people are going to buy, because that's a good market and you have a lot of people in that. And so the market for women's basketball, or the market for NASCAR, they're almost, I think actually the WNBA is bigger now, but for a while they were the same size. And I would always say to people, you would never devalue the audience for NASCAR. You would never say they don't matter or that their sports doesn't matter. They have a legitimate sporting culture for NASCAR. And so why would you say that for the WNBA? But now I think the WNBA is getting a little bit bigger. But that is the argument, that you're not reaching every sports fan through one sport, even the NFL. And so making sure that you have balanced coverage, that you're investing in lots of different things, so that you can reach different markets, is also a great strategy.
Well, let's end on a fun note, because my favorite thing to do with you is go to the US Open. And by the time this episode drops, we will be fully in the first round of the men's and women's singles of the Open. What are you looking forward to the most of this tournament, Jane?
What am I looking forward to? Honestly, I've been so knee deep in 85ers and getting ready for my classes that I'm teaching this semester that honestly, this is the first time I've actually thought about the tournament.
I mean, I think that that's totally fair. You've got a lot going on. I'll say that, obviously we've got some American men doing some interesting things. We've got some American women doing interesting things. And we've got Venus Williams just turning back the hands of time somehow.
It's incredible. Actually, that has been incredible. And you bring that up. If you looked at the average age of a player when she came in to play tennis, it was like you'd retired at 27. She was 17 and now she's 45, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I hope she plays as long as she wants to. She is completely, and Serena as well, completely redefined what the lifespan is for an athlete and what they're capable of. And I think we're just learning what women are capable of physically. I'll tell you this too. When I worked at ESPN, how if you work at a major newspaper, you do canned obituaries, right? So when I was at ESPN, I had to write the Venus Williams retirement story, which is still sitting there somewhere.
Jade, I have known you for however more than a decade, and that is the first time actually hearing that. That's incredible. I hope you have that draft somewhere. It's probably absolutely useless at this point. Oh, that is amazing. Jane, I love you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to talk to you. You're like the smartest person I know, especially when it comes to women's sports. And we're only going to continue to need to talk to you in the future. So
I am 100% here whenever you need me, Kavitha. As you know, a ton of respect for you and everything you've done.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning into Sportly. Tune in next week and every week after for a new episode. And if you have thoughts or suggestions for a topic you'd like me to cover, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to email me at kavitha@immigrantlypod.com. And if you've been enjoying our episodes so far, please leave us a rating and review on the podcast app of your choice. Sportly is an Immigrantly Media production. This episode was produced by Paroma Chakravarti. Our executive producer is Sadia Khan. Our sound designer and editor is Paroma Chakravarti. Our theme music was created by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Tune back in next week for more Sportly.